Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Transcendent Naturalism on the Cognitive Science Show. I'm here with my ongoing partner in all of the Cognitive Sciences Show, Greg Enriquez. We are joined again by somebody we both think very, very highly of. And I'm just going to again promote his excellent book, Crossing the Threshold: Etheric Imagination and the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. Don't be put off by the title. This book is both accessible and deep, and it's rare that you get those together. You usually have to trade one for the other, but this is just a truly amazing book, and I don't know if it's going to come into focus or not. Maybe not. There we are.
Oh, there it is.
And yeah, so go ahead and get this book. And also Matt's previous book, The Physics of the World Soul, also excellent. If you want some of the best introductions to the complexity of Whitehead's thought while making it relevant and expressing it elegantly, Matt's work is the best to my mind. So Matt was here already
Thanks,
with
John.
us. You're welcome, Matt. It's not flattery, it's earned. Matt was with us last time. Last time we ended on some very provocative statements. Matt had to run, and so we just sort of Matt said something. This is not quite verbatim, but close to it. Just like I wouldn't call myself a naturalist, I wouldn't call myself a spiritualist. We started talking about the idea of distributed cognition, collective intelligence, and the idea of spirit again. And that had come up, and of course, a major reason why people are interested in Whitehead is he has a something like a post-theistic notion of God in some very important ways, especially if you think of theism as bound to notions of substance, Aristotelian sort of notions, which is not an odd thing to say about classical theism, although I think the Eastern Orthodox tradition breaks with that tradition. But we can get into all of that because the topic we're going to wrestle with today, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the touchstone case. And we've bumped into it multiple times before with other people here. But can transcendent naturalism talk in an edifying and helpful way, explanatory way, without being explaining away, of the sacred? Can we have the sacred without the supernatural? That's what we're going to tackle today. And I can't think of any better person that I'd want to talk to about that than Matt. But first, I'm going to let my good friend and constant colleague say anything he'd like to say as way of introduction and greeting to Matt, and then we'll turn things over to Matt.
Yeah, no, absolutely enjoyed our last conversation. Really looking forward to today. We talked a little bit about the distributed cognition and then into spirituality. I really enjoyed our conversations about naturalism and the multi-perspectival, sort of the interreligion vantage point that resonated deeply with me. So I look forward to picking that up and exploring your interpretation of Whitehead's views and to see if this weird amalgamation of transcendent naturalism is just the right of spiritual, anti-spiritual, natural, anti-natural to pull together some sort of synthesis or not. But I really look forward to today's conversation. So welcome, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Thanks, John. I really, really enjoyed the conversation last time. And thankfully today I don't have a hard stop. So we can dig in a little bit. The sacred without supernaturalism is a great way of setting up this conversation because, I think immediately of a Whiteheadian, David Ray Griffin, who passed recently. He wrote a book called Re-Enchantment Without Supernaturalism and unpacks a basically Whiteheadian perspective on how you can achieve that, where re-enchantment would be a term that would restore something that sort of modern scientific
there you go.
Materialism.
John, have you heard of that book?
Yeah, just holding up so people can see it. That's the book Matt's referring to. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So how do we restore a sense of enchantment, which would be one way of describing what that might look like is the interior of the human being is somehow resonating with the interiority of nature. the interiority of the cosmos. And the whole idea of the non-human world having an inside is it becomes increasingly incredible as scientific materialism and sort of Enlightenment politics. We can get into the way in which this birth of human freedom and a sense of individual freedom also kind of comes alongside with this alienation from nature, in a sense that nature doesn't have an interior. And so the question about how to avoid supernaturalism is a question of how to restore a sense of interiority to nature that doesn't require going beyond nature in any way, but actually perceiving nature more concretely, more adequately, so that we can keep all the boons of modernity and the Enlightenment while also restoring what was lost, which is the sacred. It's a great word for it. And where my imagination wants to go immediately is to understand what we might mean by the sacred has something to do with sacrifice and like self-sacrifice in some deep sense, which I think is the antidote to the kind of runaway individualism that drives our society, our economy today. Because what's clear, I think, and I assume you both agree, and so much of your work is already in many ways participating in this. We live in a post-secular time. Religion is back in all of the ways, negative and hopefully some positive ways too. So we're in a post-secular period, and the sacred is with us, and there's a deep relationship between violence and the sacred. But I think there's also a relationship that all three of us would want to restore to the sacred, that would be integrative, that would be a source of wisdom, a source of compassion, and so on, right? So there's the danger of the way in which a connection to something sacred can lead us to cause harm to others. And there's a way in which it can lead us to a more compassionate way of suffering together, just define what compassion means in some sense. So maybe I'll pause there and welcome you two to chime in on those thoughts.
Well, I've been talking a lot. Thank you, by the way. That's a great setup. I've been talking a lot with a bunch of people. I was on the Sacred podcast with Elizabeth, and just talked with Ian McGilchrist and Dan Schmachtenberger, and this topic came up. Been talking with Jordan Hall about it, and a bunch of people. I'm thinking about it a lot. I can't remember. There's been a couple other podcasts I've been on. I remember Elizabeth from the Sacred. She sort of primed a question that she uses with other people. She said to get people thinking about the sacred, she goes like this: "What would you not take money to give up?" And I thought that's a good practical sort of criterion, but I didn't find that ultimately satisfying, because that could also apply to somebody's particular fetishistic obsession or something that they have compulsively addicted to. So there's an element in there. And I think what it's pointing to, what I think what she's trying to get to, is money is the exemplar of instrumental value, and the sacred is supposed to be somehow something that is intrinsically valuable to us. And so I want to push it, and I'm going to push it in the direction that Matt was suggesting. I think meaning in life is a way of getting at the sacred, not the meaning of life, but meaning in life. I do research on this, and there's philosophical work by Wolff, there's psychological work by Hicks, and a whole bunch of other people, and just a ton of work. And there's a bunch of characteristics that goes into it. But one of the ones that goes into it that might even be the most significant of the four factors: intelligibility matters, purpose matters, sort of a sense of realness matters. But this other one is mattering. You need to be connected to something that has a reality and a value beyond your egocentric existence. And this is where the self sort of sacrificing nature comes in. And this is why many people, when they're asked what's sacred to them, they say they're children, because this is the kind of relationship you have with your children. It's agapic. Right? You don't love them for what they can do for you or give you. You love them because you want them to actually exist after you're not here. And you want to make a difference to them now because you want them to exist even when you don't. And so children are sort of prototypical of that. And I think Greg had some amazing things to say about how the fact that we're, primate mammals has made us capable of this kind of agapic concern. And of course, human beings seem to be able to turn that onto things other than other human beings, which is something we're talking about, I believe. And so meaning in life, but I think there's more to the sacred than that. I think it's meaning in life, but when we're connected to it and we find that we're falling in love with it because it is taking us deeper into reality, right? And so, and this is what I would now mean to say where I find my partner sacred because of the kind of relationship we have with each other. But I would then put one more order in this, higher order. Sometimes we can have a meaning in life connection to something we're falling in love with in a sense that and it is taking us into a depth of reality that is actually bearing us to what is ultimate reality. And I think when we love ultimate reality as sacred, I think that that is often what people were trying to articulate, along with other things. I'm just talking about phenomenologically now. I think that's what they were often trying to articulate with some of the terms for the most sacred, like God or Tao or Brahman, is this, falling in love, enhanced, mattering, meaning in life with something that's real. In fact, perhaps you're getting an increasing sense of it being ultimately real. And so I think that's at least convergent with what you were talking about, Matt, because when we're loving somebody, we want our interiority and their interiority to come into this reciprocally opening relationship. We want it to deepen. We use all these metaphors. I'm more and more deeply in love with you, and things like that. And then, of course, we want to make a difference to these people. And this is where this really converges with Greg's work, I think, really tremendously about why we find agape intrinsically. I would go first part. Says, I mean, we are born from agape. We are sustained by agape. We aspire in agape. And a life without agape is a life probably of deep trauma and perhaps dehumanization. It's a profoundly horrible life. And so all of that's coming together. But I think when all of that has been exapted, so it is in relationship to what we consider most ultimate. I think that's the superlative sacred for us, if I can put it that way. Because I think we need a notion of the sacred that can cover, I'll use this as a placeholder term, God and our kids and works of art. Many people will answer that question with a work of art is sacred to them. I think it's for me the Adagio from Beethoven's Seventh is just like that for me. So that's what I've tried to do. And now and then I'll shut up. I think all of those are phenomenologically rich. All of them can be explained, and I've already gestured with the work towards Greg work and also some of my work. They can be functionally understood, and none of them require supernaturalism. None of them require supernaturalism. And that's a proposal. And I was picking up on what you said, Matt. And then what I'm hoping, obviously I want to hear from Greg first, but I'm hoping also, Matt, how, if that's enough for you to work with so that you can start to sink some Whiteheadian teeth into it and really get some traction on it. Because I mean, I think there's enough convergence. It's you, of course, both of you are both recognizing this is ultimately a Platonic proposal I'm making, obviously. And so that should have some significant convergence with Whitehead. So first of all, what do you think, Greg, of that proposal?
I think it's beautiful, John. I think it's beautiful. I think that so in terms of the sacred is going to be about expanding beyond the egoic individual. It's going to be expanding beyond that in a transcendent sort of way. It's going to be to do a little bit of Wilbur. It's a pre-trans line in my estimation, and that's going to create a gripping of our epistemic ontic relation that's going to open up worlds for us. And as it opens up, and as the world discloses itself, and we disclose ourselves to the world, we feel that conscious expansion and feel that oneness connection transcending ourselves. And the beauty of what I would argue that transcendent naturalism is pointing to, and through your framing of it, is actually there's a strong transcendence by which collectively and through a dialectic into dialogos, we can afford ourselves the capacity to orient towards the sacred as a collective, and do so, and in so doing transform. And that process, I think, has been sacred throughout the ages, and that process is orienting us toward an ultimate concern in a Tillich sort of way.
Yeah.
And so to me, we can be, the universe says, God / the universe has afforded us a capacity to be oriented toward the sacred.
I love all of this. I think art and our appreciation for art as something that can inspire these feelings of transcendence is important. The sense in which our love for family, for friends, for community, as much as we can experience the transcendent, the sacred in our relationship to other human beings, is the more we can experience that, I think the more we will flourish, obviously, as communities, and that we have a that very natural form, very human form of the sacred is severely lacking in our time, and there are so many conditions that are driving it to worsen, this feeling of disconnection from others. And so absolutely we need ways to reconnect with one another, to discover something sacred in just everyday human relationships, whether that's a marriage, that's relationships to children, to our elders, and broader, beyond just friendships, but communities that we're loyal to. I think this is a sort of basic source of meaning that is evaporating from more and more people's lives. And in the domain of art and sort of the aesthetic means that we have to produce experiences of the sacred, that seems to being a little bit better. I think I continue to be impressed by works of art that are being created now. Certainly there's plenty of examples over the course of human history that we can also draw upon there. I didn't hear yet about nature as a source of the sacred, or something that we could relate to as sacred. And I think that's where things get especially interesting, because like I started off asking, like, how can we relate to nature itself as something sacred? And I think that has something to do with granting an interiority to the world, to the cosmos, even the physical world. And in my work, I think it's the word God is a good way of talking about the interiority of the world. And this is where you could draw on this sort of Neoplatonic idea of the world soul. And what does it mean to talk about a soul of the world in a way that's not supernatural, but that's fully consistent with and not in any way meant as a to be in contradiction with any of our scientific knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, and I won't go to the Whitehead yet. I'll hold that because I can tell Greg wants to chime in here.
Right. I do want to chime in. John will know this, but you, for me, it speaks very much directly to this idea of the sacred in nature. And I'll go one level below our personhood into our primate heart. Okay. So inside of Utah, there's a thing called the influence matrix, which maps our primate heart. And it's initially called the influence matrix because I'm doing standard evolutionary psychology stuff, whereby the idea is that to the extent that I can influence others in accordance with my interests, I'm in a better space to control the flow of resources. And to the extent that I struggle with that, I feel anxiety and worry. And that's the original formulation. And I think that has some genuine validity to it. However, it expands and becomes the relational value and social influence matrix, whereby what we're tracking is not so much just the instrumentality of our social influence, meaning our capacity to move others in accordance with our influence and context, but to the extent to which we're seen, known, and valued, okay, for the essence of who we are. And this emerged in my clinical work where there were a lot of people who actually had a fair amount of influence, but felt like imposters. Okay? And they felt like in this context, as long as people see me this way, I feel okay. But I'm not sure that's my true essence. And I kind of fake my true essence so that I get the contingent positive responses. But if they knew the real me, oh my God, right? And then you look at, well, people who feel like they're in love with the real me themselves and who others are in love with the real me across time. And look at other kinds of contexts where, say, a wife gets demented, but the husband stays and maintains care, even though the social influence of that has been lost in terms of her capacity to be in the world. But he loves her for her essence, okay? or however we might want to frame that. But what the angle of this gives rise to, which I do think it speaks to the human soul in a particular way, is to be seen, known, and valued, to be essentially loved for your essence. And I actually, and in retrospect of this sort of like, yeah, this mechanical stuff isn't enough because mechanics can change. You're tracking your sort of eternal view across context, if you will. Okay. And then the essence of who you are in the eternal view across context. And in that regard, what I think you can then see is like, oh, if we look at capitalism, for instance, capitalism just translates you essentially into the token of your utility, you know? Which certainly we had John Hall on here in the previous, and he talked about various languages, a sacred language, a family language, and a trade language. This capitalism structure is fine for trade language in many ways, for just translating instrumentally for individuals who don't have the necessity of a long-term embodied, connected, true to the self, valued relation. But ultimately, what I would say is if we just go down one level, my primate heart seeks to be known and valued and seen by John. Okay. You know? And if all of a sudden instrumentally it doesn't work anymore and he discards me, I'll be hurt by that, right? And that's what I think John means by agape. And so for me, nature does have or certainly we can talk about how far this goes, but the interiority of nature, and certainly the interiority of many animals and maybe living things and maybe inanimate things we can discuss. But this issue of core essential value actually has emerged and emanated from the unfolding. And I think it's been grossly misunderstood, mischaracterized, misframed by a mechanical reductive view. I think it's grossly misunderstood, mischaracterized, and misframed by our capitalist structure. And I think that part of what we need to do is rediscover and reclaim that aspect of our being. So anyway, that's what I want to say. Is sort of a play connected to the interiority of nature, connect the concept of the sacred, at least in my journey.
Yeah, that's lovely. And so nature here is is our primate nature, as it were. And so love, would you say love becomes relevant at that scale complexity, but wasn't necessarily part of the universe before that?
That's a great question. It's certainly relevant at our primate heart. It's certainly relevant in our animal nature, I think. Organism nature, object
Right.
nature. That
Yeah,
starts to get really fascinating to me. But I want to certainly plant a flag in the world that says it's definitely present at our primate heart.
absolutely. Yeah. This need for mutual recognition, um, that we can't really know who we are. I mean, being a self is a social process. Individuation is a cultural social process that begins with primates, it seems. But I so my question is, how deep does the interiority of nature go? Is it only so deep as to um, open up at the level of primates, mammals, limbic systems, or does it go deeper? Single
Sure.
cells.
Right.
That's
Atoms.
or beyond. Yeah. So how deep
Right.
does love go? How deep does the inside of nature go? I think is a good question. And if I, unless John, you want to chime in on this question, I wanted to
Well,
bring in some
well,
white
I
hand, but
wanted
go
to, I
ahead.
wanted to make it more difficult for you to answer, because that's what friends do. Um, because I want to sort of problematize it. I always believe in trying to get things as properly problematized as possible first. I think we're on the right track, and I want to slow down. There's two things that this can collapse into as kind of, and I think of them as potentially Scylla and Charybdis. One is the sort of Kantian Hegelian argument that we only enter the geistlich spirit, we only enter the world of spirit when we are motivated by a sense of commitment above and beyond desire. So animals all have desires, but we do things out of commitment. And with commitment is responsibility. Responsibility has to do with authority and reciprocal recognition, and it ties into Greg's argument there. And if that is the definition of spirit, then it would be pretty hard to see it dropping below the primate level. If that argument, now it's not clear if Hegel was being thought he was being exhaustive or not. So, but let's just say there certainly it could be read that way. That's one end. The other end is knows the opposite. It's Descartes and comes in and says, "Oh, I know what you're talking about with the interiority. You're talking about a soul. You used the word soul, and I know what souls are. Souls are substances in the Aristotelian word." In the Aristotelian sense, not an element like matter would, but the kind of thing that is the bearer of the predicates, never itself the predicate. Underneath all the properties, there's the substance. I have the wax, and I can melt the wax, and I can do all this, and I change all of its properties, but it's the same wax underneath. And that's the interiority of the wax. It's its substance. And what we mean by substance is what it is independent of its relationship to everything else. And many people would, and they'll use the like a word essence from in Aristotle to try and grasp that. And that, of course, I mean, there's a couple things driving that. One is, I think, as Mesley says, it's because we're just bound. Well, Nietzsche said it first. I fear we believe in God because we're not getting rid of grammar, or something like that. We're not getting. Sorry, I fear we're not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar, which is, we have a subject predicate language, and we can, in a linguistic expression, we can keep the subject constant and change all the predicates, and we think we've discovered something about reality that way. And Descartes said, I could imagine the wax hanging in empty space and it would still be the same wax. And of course, I think everything that Descartes says there is, I understand why people find it plausible. I think it's deeply mistaken, profoundly mistaken. I think that idea of substance and a substance ontology is, I think, at the root of nominalism. It's at the root of dualism. It's clearly at the root of both of those in Descartes. I think it's at the root of also supernaturalism. You tend to try and make the soul some sort of supernatural being, which it clearly sort of becomes for Descartes. And so, on one hand, you have yeah, what Harman might call overmining, where you say, all I mean by spirit is this social network of commitments and authority and responsibility. And that's what makes human beings very different. That's what makes them persons and different. And that, of course, that doesn't translate down. And then the other is, oh, what I mean is soul, substance, in the Cartesian sense. And the problem I have with that is that also seems like it's not going to, well, by its very definition, it's not going to bleed into the rest of reality. It's certainly not going to bleed into uh, Descartes' material reality because, right, the soul is a substance. It is none of its existence other than purely accidental or contingent is bound up with how it's related to other things. Um, and so those are two common ways in which the West has taken your point about interiority and reinterpreted. Oh, what we mean by interiority is morality, broadly understood, the Hegelian sense, right? But broadly understood, that's what we mean. We mean the moral life of, right? Yeah. Oh, no, no. What we mean is soul existence, the inner substance. When you're talking about interiority, these are the two answers that have prototypically been given. And I hear you saying, and I think with, clear provenance in Whitehead, that you want to reject both of those when you're invoking this notion of interiority. So I'm trying to give you a problem that gives you a greater contrast class against which you can specify what you mean by interiority in the sacred. I hope that was helpful and not distracting.
Oh, it's very helpful, John. And you said, you were going to make it harder for me, but I think you may have actually made it easier because you're making all these important distinctions about what I don't want to say and what Whitehead does help us say in a contemporary register about a word like God or a word like soul, because Whitehead develops this. It's a process ontology or a process relational ontology, but it's also a process theology. He does find in the course of constructing his cosmological scheme in process and reality, and even before that in Science in the Modern World, where he begins to do metaphysics for the first time in the latter part of that book, he does find it necessary to make reference to God or to a God, a divine function, as Isabel Stengers refers to it in her book on Whitehead. And this is a metaphysician's God akin to Aristotle's God. It's not at least primarily an object of religious feeling or emotion. It can become that, certainly. But like Whitehead says about Aristotle, actually, when he develops his idea of the unmoved mover, or this idea of God as thought thinking itself, that this is, for Whitehead, one of the few examples we have in Western history of somebody dispassionately considering the question of God without religious emotion running the show. And Whitehead wants to do something similar. And for him, rather than God, as it was for Aristotle, being the source of motion in the world, Whitehead says we don't have that problem in contemporary physics. We have an analogous problem, though, which is how you get something actual out of infinite possibility. And so for Whitehead, God becomes this principle of limitation, he says, or a principle of concretion, whereby possibility gains some conditioning that allows for an actual world to unfold. But Whitehead will later come to see that God has another side. And so God ends up being dipolar in Whitehead's mature theology. It's not just this principle of limitation, which he also describes as God in the role of, and another word in Greek for what in English we collapse into love would be eros. The primordial nature of God would be this original erotic desire for a particular arrangement of possibility, a particular ordering of what could be the case. And so God in this erotic primordial function is the yearning after what could be. And that is already a kind of radical idea of God, because it makes God kind of, rather than pure act, God is almost pure possibility. And the yearning after something that's merely ideal it's the potential for something beautiful, but not yet actual beauty. Nicholas of Cusa comes close to this in some of his
Yes.
renderings of God as
Yes.
passe ipsum. But then there's this other pole of God, which is what Whitehead calls the consequent nature of God, which is more like agape, and it's God responsive to the world. In Whitehead's theology, God doesn't create the world, he says, or at least if you're going to say God creates the world, you also have to say the world creates God, because there's a reciprocality, a co-creativity. God in the consequent pole becomes God as the poet of the world, Whitehead says, that's feeling everything that happens to each individual creature and atoning for it, you might say, trying to see in light of that primordial vision of what could be, of the most beautiful possible outcome. God tries to atone for all of the failures to live up to that ideal in the wreckage of history, and make it beautiful despite all of that, as a kind of, to use one of Tolkien's words, a eucatastrophe, in light of a kind of vision of a eucatastrophe, where for Whitehead, tragedy is the highest form of beauty, right? Because you have, he says, the dream of youth that initiates this longing for the beautiful, and then you have the harvest of tragedy, where that ideal longing meets the finitude and the failure of realization fully, but nonetheless is able to harvest something from that. And so this isn't an all-powerful God. This isn't a God that's got coercive power that would allow it to eliminate evil. Evil becomes a function of creativity and evolution, and the fact that even God is, for Whitehead, caught up in the creative advance. And so you get this interesting interplay in Whitehead between eros and agape, I think, as these twin elements in the divine nature, where God begins as eros and ends as agape. And so there's almost, you could say there's like a learning process taking place for God. Cosmogenesis is that learning process. And so rather than God being this large and in charge substance that transcends the world and creates it out of nothing, God becomes the interior of the world process that is luring what occurs in light of this ideal that's implanted in every creature's experience, Whitehead would say, but not able to determine how creatures will respond to that lure. And then whatever happens in God's consequent nature, there's this love for the world, this agapic love for the world that makes it all whole again. And Whitehead would say that finite creatures can in some way participate in that consequent nature of God. And so, this word love in English, I think, is super saturated in our time. We need it to do a lot of work for us.
Yeah, and it's equivalent because of that.
Right. But I think if we're going to use it, I think I would just want to say here in closing to this set of comments is like, and I've heard you say this before, John, love is not a feeling.
No, it's not even an emotion.
It's not an emotion. And if anything, agape has me. Agape has us. I don't have it.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And even with eros, I would say I don't have eros either. Eros is a lack. That's what I don't have.
Yeah.
Right. And so however we want to, deepen our definition of love to get below the superficial meaning of the term, it's not something that we have. It's not a mere emotion. It has a deeper provenance. So I'll pause there.
That was helpful, and I want to keep on this, but I don't want this to sound like I don't think you have responded, because you have. But I still want to come back to, yes, but if this interiority isn't spirit understood as our capacity for morality, or soul indicating the ultimate subject, the ultimate substance within us, that within us that stays the same no matter what relations we enter into, no matter what happens. And I don't know why anybody would want such an entity. It's like why would anybody want absolute free will is also beyond me. But presumably that's how this thing acts, etc. Um, and the reason I'm pushing on this is because you described this interiority, and you described nature has this interiority. This interiority is the soul of nature, and that's what God is. And I'm saying, and I like what you said about love, but I don't yet get, what are you meaning by these terms, right? What are you meaning by soul if you don't mean Hegelian Geist, and if you don't mean Cartesian soul, substance? What are we saying here? Um,
Yeah.
Is that fair, or am I being hard?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the challenge here is just, having been so influenced by Whitehead, the main challenge is how do you translate his terms into something that invites understanding from those who haven't read his work, right? But society, his term society, his concept of a society, the immediate answer I would give in response to this important question is, why is soul not, if soul isn't substance, then what is it? And Whitehead is it's a society or a nexus. In other words, a relationship that we have to earlier versions of ourselves, to talk in the personal psychological register.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. Keep going, because there's a lot. I mean, let's talk at that level, and then try to take it back into the non-personal or the transpersonal, because
right.
Okay, so let's talk about a self. Let's do that. One thing you can think of yourself as and there's a whole thing we're having where we're trying to overmine the self, and the self, all we mean by self is our intersection in the groups we belong to and our moral commitments. It's a completely sort of superficial Hegelian understanding of what the self is, right? That's happening right now. We've got that huge movement on, right? Then there's the older. No, what I mean by the self is, again, this inner, this inner substance, again, not stuff, the super subject that never changes, that's always me, no matter what. And this shows up in really sort of, hard, this shows up in very practical psychological bias. So if you ask people, how much have you changed in the last 10 years, and they'll say a lot. And you ask them, how much will you change in the next 10 years? And they'll say very little. And they'll say that every 10 years. And they'll say that every 10 years, right? They don't get that they think they are a complete or finished thing, even though but they don't actually live it that way. So I like what you said, because there's a sense in which a self, right, is this, it is somehow a coming out of the past and a going towards the future. But there's more, I think, right? And right, and it has, a self has a lack in it, right? Like you said, it has an eros, but a self also creates. How you make a self is by having other selves create you, right? That's kind of right, even of a Gotskian sense. So I'm just trying to give it all back to you and say, okay, let's say, well, let's do it psychologically. Let's talk about what makes a self, and then try to take it back. Is that fair?
Yeah, let's do that. I mean, I'm tempted to say a self or soul, and we could make important distinctions between self, soul, spirit. But just to speak in general of this sense of identity that we have that seems to persist through time, I'm tempted to say a self is a nexus of relationships, but because that at least gets us out of the Cartesian substance ontology, where a self, like a substance, would be that which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. Clearly, we do need each other to exist as selves.
Yes.
because of these rituals, social rituals, and the dialectics of mutual recognition that Fichte and Hegel worked out in such profound detail. But I don't want to just reduce us to human social relations.
Right.
Either. So this is where nature becomes important, I think. And this is, Hegel has a philosophy of nature too, but you get less emphasis on the way that human social activity is grounded in nature, because in Hegel, or let's say in Hegelianism, just so Hegel's a very complicated thinker to work out exactly what he's saying, but as he's generally been understood, I think nature becomes something always already mediated by a human culture. And so we can't actually, anything we say about nature is going to be part of our cultural activity.
Right? I agree.
Whereas in Schelling, his friend and collaborator, they had a break, but I think there's reason to believe that they became friends before Hegel died again. But in Schelling, you get this profound appreciation for nature as something that can't be, that's not always already mediated by culture, that we have some direct intuition of, immediate access to, and that somehow the ground of nature is also the ground of ourselves, of spirit, and wants to see, with some help from Spinoza, but a non-substantial version of a more processed version of Spinoza that Schelling's working out. Wants to understand spirit and nature, or God and nature, as two ways of looking at the same process, let's say.
Right.
I think that's very similar to the move that Whitehead wants to make. And so, self or soul is more about this nexus of relationship, but it's a relationality that goes all the way down and isn't merely a matter of symbolic mediation within a symbolic community, like not just that kind of social relation, but the relation of ourselves to one another, and the relation of electrons to protons, and that there's a profound relationality and a kind of love, to go back to the earlier part of this conversation, that does that Plato and Dante, they're not wrong, these philosopher poets, when they say that it's love that makes the world go round. It's I think Dante says, and Plato as well, friendship is what keeps the planets in their orbits. And yes, of course, it's a metaphor, but I think this is where I would want to go, and I think it can be naturalistic to begin to seriously make these analogies between love, what all that word carries for us as human beings, and gravity, right? Like, I think we could go all the way down with it. So,
well, this is excellent. The nexus, and I'm still, when there's love, I'm in a relationship to an interiority. Let's say that into what makes a net. So I have Whitehead's collaborator Russell in my head right now, right? Oh, you're talking about, right, the internal, right, the intrinsic that is never grasped by all the external relations, and that just sounds to me like that goes nowhere. I know I've met Phil Goff and his stuff on that, but about consciousness, and I think it should be taken seriously, of course, because he's a good philosopher. But for me, I'm trying to get at, if when I am loving, and I agree with you, it's only been disclosed in a kind of love, both the eros, and the agapic. When I am loving, and it's disclosing the interiority, and that's not just looking at social relations, and it's not looking into some immaterial thing that is completely supernaturally self-existent. When I'm looking into my beloved soul, and there's an interiority there, like, what is the interiority? We don't mean, or do we, physical interiority? We don't mean like the way I'm inside my house right now, right? And we don't mean like a moral meaning, and we don't mean a substantial meaning of interiority, like the way the properties are in the subject, the predicates are in the subject. We've agreed that we've given up those two senses of in. Is that fair, Matt? Right? And I'm trying to get, and I'm sorry, I'm being dogged about this because this concerns me like profoundly, existentially, right? Because I think this is for me where the sacred has where there has to be a naturalistic explanation to the profoundest experiences of the sacred, is where we can give and say, okay, I don't mean the in of predication, I don't mean the in of moral commitment of social relation, I mean something else. It's this nexus, but what is it? Right? What makes it in as opposed to out? What makes it deep as opposed to surface? This is what I'm trying to get at. See, well, I think I agree with Metzler that one of the original motivations for the idea of reality being based in substances is predicate, subject predicate language. But I think, and I don't disagree with that. And, and Wittgenstein banged into that and then realized that was a mistake. And he moved away from the Tractatus to the investigations, etc. And I take it that's all well argued and well said. But I take it that there's another problem. Here's the problem. We seem to need a distinction between appearance and reality, or between error and truth, and they have an asymmetric relation. Appearance is asymmetrically dependent on reality. Error is asymmetrically dependent on truth. And therefore we think, right, that leads us to think that there's something that everything else depends on, but it depends on nothing else. Does that make sense? Because if you've got this asymmetric dependence, there must be a final thing that everything depends on, but it does not depend on them. And that's what you can mean by depth. I'm getting down to that thing. And I take it we're trying to reject that, but we can't give up appearance. I don't think we can give up the appearance reality distinction or the distinction between error and truth. I think that would be just a disaster. So I'm trying to get at what is this sense of deeper in, more real interiority, right? That allows us to keep that important relation, but doesn't put us into all I mean is social relation. You're just in social relation. That's all you meant by it. It doesn't just mean, oh, you're talking about your Cartesian substance. What is it though? What's that interiority? What's behind all the metaphors of inner, deeper, that doesn't get me back into the substance language? Or another way of putting it, if everything's in relationship to everything else, why don't I just have an absolutely diffuse Gansfeld in which nothing is deeper than anything else, nothing is more real than anything else? I'm sorry, I'm really struggling aloud with you because I'm trying to articulate what I'm wrestling with around this. And I want to do this with you because I think and you too, Greg, of course, but I want to do this with you, Matt, because you, I think, are one of the best people I could possibly talk to about this.
Well, I appreciate that, John. And I right back at both of you. I want to go back to Russell. You brought in his discomfort and with and desire to move beyond internal relations and particularly the way that the British idealists like F.H. Bradley understood the consequences of taking something like internal relations seriously. But I think that's a whole interesting history there. The rise of analytic philosophy and its resistance to what had been the dominant school of thought in Britain. This idealism that is inheriting Hegel, but with a interesting, like F.H. Bradley has this interesting way of reading. He's a Hegelian for sure, and emphasizing this the absolute, but he has a sort of empiricist way of talking about the absolute in terms, and it's a whole philosophy of feelings and as internal relations, and so it's a very you could see Hume and Mill and others like in the background for Bradley, even as he's defending this absolute idealist position. Russell, Wittgenstein, G.E. Moore also, they all loved Bradley as students. And then because of the ways that they began to think through logically the consequences of some of these ideas, they all of a sudden had to break with that mode of thought and develop this whole new approach, analyzing our language. And I think Whitehead is a very interesting figure here because, of course, he's a collaborator with Russell in developing this new logic. Also takes F.H. Bradley's idealism very seriously, but ends up, when he develops his process philosophy, not fitting into either side of this dichotomy between analytic and idealist approaches, or more mystical approaches. There's definitely a mystical side to Whitehead's philosophy, but there's also a rigorous logical justification for what he's doing. There's an attempt to preserve this distinction between true and false propositions. He wants a correspondence theory of truth, but he also recognizes a coherence theory of truth as well. He wants both, which to unpack how he achieves that would take a lot of time. But Whitehead takes this issue very seriously. And what he does is, it's a kind of interesting and brilliant, I think, compromise position where he agrees with Russell that we can't just get rid of external relations and say everything's internally related to everything else. But Whitehead, in a way, temporalizes this distinction. And he says that every entity is internally related to everything that has occurred in its past, because it includes what has occurred in its past in itself, but externally related to everything in its future. Externally related to possibility, in other words.
Right.
And so you get this asymmetry of relationship. It's really, this is the key to Whitehead's whole ontology, is the way he's able to integrate both what Russell is pointing out about the importance of external relations for us to say anything meaningful about the world, and that we can make meaningful statements about the world in those terms, shows that we need to find some way of metaphysically anchoring this. But we also have these internal relationships to one another. And when we think about what is soul or what is interiority, I think the risk in going too far and being too loose with that is that we end up with some notion of the absolute that tempts us into a kind of, nosedive into the dissolution of any sense of individuality and the absorption in a kind of narcissistic oceanic feeling. And that, I think, leads to, it's a quite prevalent form of spirituality nowadays, I think.
Yes.
And so we don't want to give up truth and falsehood and the epistemological rigor that allows us to make distinctions like that. We don't want to give up distinction and separation. It's just a matter of being able to hold such distinctions in a polarity rather than creating dualisms here, right? And so I think, similarly with the appearance-reality distinction, Whitehead is very resistant to explanations, whether in science or in philosophy, metaphysics, that explain away appearance, what appears to be true, or explain away common sense or something like that. He thinks the job of the philosopher is always going to be to, his exact words are, weld science and common sense with common sense, right? So that we don't ever lose touch with either. Science is always going to be disturbing our common sense because it's making new discoveries that, force us to look again. But Whitehead's point is we're always going to have to look again at how the world appears to us and integrate this new theoretical knowledge we have with how the world appears to us. And problems start when you're so model-centric in your science that you've given up even trying to to weld it to common sense.
Yeah.
You just say, oh, it can't be done. Just shut up and calculate. And so for Whitehead, we need to pursue the truth and be in love with reality, but recognize that the fact that reality appears at all, the fact that there is an experiential dimension to reality, means that we're always going to need to hold the two together, with science and common sense. And truth, he defines as the confirmation of appearance to reality. If there were no appearance, if there were no experiential or interior aspect, truth isn't even relevant. It just doesn't even come up, right? Mm. Truth implies this relationship, and maintaining that relationship between appearance and reality is the struggle, rather than thinking we could vanquish the appearance or not consider it all that important.
So that's where beauty comes in, where beauty is where appearances are disclosing of reality,
yes,
and distorting or distracting. So there was a moment where I think I got this. So there's there's all the internal relations to the things that are in your past, and then there's an external relationality towards the possibilities of the future. Did I get that right? Am I understand? And is that the nexus of relations that you were referring to earlier? That point right there, and that point where the internal relations and the external relations are actually bound together in some fashion. And then the very tricky question becomes, and I'm not trying to do any kind of Zen thing on you, Graham Priest would probably want to know, but what kind of relation holds the internal and the external relations together? But I think this is what you're pointing to, is that's kind of there's an ineffable ineffable bond between the internal and the external relations, and that's where we find the interiority. That's where we find soul. Am I getting you right? Am I understanding this?
Yeah, it's
that's brilliant. And that's bound up then with time and causation in a profound way.
Mm-hmm. This is what concrescence is all about, which is, Whitehead's term for what he calls, when you can analyze concrescence using what Whitehead calls genetic analysis, and you say it's ineffable. It is ineffable. This is how novelty is produced. This is what Whitehead's trying to describe philosophically, and he has a lot to say about it, as ineffable as it is. So we can try to describe it, and it is not easy to grok. And I've been in many dialogues. I had a very long dialogue with a very smart person who I think you both know, the analytic idealist Bernardo Castro.
Yes,
sure.
We talked about Whitehead. He indulged me I think we spoke for almost 3 hours, and
he's always gracious.
Yeah, and I don't think it clicked for him. He just didn't get why what I was describing was important, or what it elucidated. And that is humbling, I think, because not there's something. Whitehead himself says there's an imaginative leap required here to understand what I'm doing. I think that's true for all metaphysics, and the difficulty of translating from one metaphysical scheme into another metaphysical scheme is huge. It's actually, I'm not even sure if it's easier to make that translation happen when both parties involved in that conversation already have a more or less explicit metaphysics, versus trying to do it with someone who thinks they don't have a metaphysics, which really means they haven't become explicit about what their metaphysical assumptions are. I mean, nobody can become explicit about everything, but the work of metaphysics is to surface the conceptual presuppositions in underlying anything we might say. Anything we might say, right?
One of the associations I was having, I'll just throw this out there and see John, if you pick this up at all. I was actually getting some Carl Frisson associations with the idea of sort of an integrated information complexification structure that is reducing surprise and finding energy in a particular way. And the way he uses that term is actually quite slippery, but it's got an interior exterior blend at sort of the cusp of what is happening around memory, organization, anticipation. In Utah, we have to sort of ride the wave of complexification, and it is very much the process by which we are essentially consolidating, integrating the past iterative relationships of memory, chunking them, and anticipating and finding the right grip of the possibility space. So anyway, I was finding some resonance with your description of Whitehead and that particular line where you talked about the past and the future interrelating to relationships relative to, what are the relationships of instantiated in memory, what are the relationships of possibility across time. Anyway, I found myself making some associations there.
I think there's something right about that. I mean, for me, well, I'm not going to repeat all the arguments why I think relevance has to be inherently transjective in nature. If we try to make it subjective or objective, then we have nothing by which the subjective and the objective can be relevant to each other. And then that means we're caught in solipsism or skepticism, or we try to say that one or other of these sides is an illusion, and we get all kinds of, I think, profound mistakes. So I think, yes, insofar as I've argued, and you know this, Greg, that the predictive processing and the relevance realization presuppose and need each other in a deep way. So I think that's a fair resonance. I suppose what I want to do, though, is I want to keep pushing on it. And this is actually connected to that movie you just made. I want to keep pushing on it ontologically. Graham Priest in his thing on the book 1, he talks about the paradox of what actually holds things together. Because he said you get this weird thing, because whenever you say what holds A and B together, you say B, you get a third man argument. Well, what holds A and B together? What holds A and B together is C. Well, then what holds A to C and B to C? Well, D, and you get an infinite. And at some point, he said you're forced into doing something we don't want to do, which is to break the law of non-contradiction. And it's the only way you can get it, because what you need is basically whatever. You need A to be identical to B and B to be identical to C, but A and C not identical to each other. And of course, you can't do that with the transitivity of identity, but that's how you actually get a relation. You have to break the principle of non-contradiction. And I was thinking that that's actually what's going on here. It's like whatever myself is, it's identical to all my internal relations that have come into concrescence, but it's in some sense also has to be identical with how I go into my future possibilities. But that doesn't mean the future possibilities and the past doesn't mean the external relations and the internal relations are themselves identical. You have this weird, when you're trying to get to this fundamental relationality, you start cracking the law of non-contradiction in important ways, because you can't seem to get things together without getting just an infinite regress that is non-explanatory. And this is always what has deeply intrigued me about this, because I think this is an unavoidable argument. And it would mean that there's something properly mystical in the sense of mysterious, in that we can't finally ultimately articulate it with subject predicate language, substance ontology, etc., because we bump up against the law that is supposed to be the law that governs all possible logics and all possible subject predicate relations. And I wonder how that is landing for you, Matt.
Yeah, that's great. It's exactly the problem that Graham Priest is
Yeah.
Discussing there, that F.H. Bradley was dealing with.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of the infinite regressive relations.
Yeah.
And Relata, and actually, it's one of the interesting parts of this whole history, and Russell and Moore's arguments against Bradley is that, oh, he thinks everything's internally related to everything else. Actually, Bradley was saying the very concept of relation doesn't make sense
Yes.
because of how it violates the principle of non-contradiction, or the law of non-contradiction. And so there's a deep misunderstanding of Bradley's project in some sense that led to this reaction from the analytic school. But what Whitehead ends up doing, part of his compromise position between the idealists and the analytics, is to say it's part of why he invents this idea of an actual entity that is the result of this process of concrescence, because in this genetic analysis of a process of concrescence, Whitehead says, look, the laws of non-contradiction and the excluded middle and identity, they don't apply yet because the actual entity hasn't yet been produced. Once the process of concrescence completes itself, then we can ask, true or false, is it this or is it that? It has a definite determinate status. It can be measured, and we can reflect on it logically in propositional terms. But in the course of its concrescence, he says it's not in space and time yet. I think we can make quantum wave function analogies here. It's in this sort of as yet indeterminate space of possibility. The decision is being made. It's in the process of being made about how this entity will be. And, when you're first approaching Whitehead's thought and he says atomism is the fundamental metaphysical truth, you're like, wait, what? But he means atomicity in the sense of, the original Greek sense of uncuttable, whole. In other words, that it's this process of concrescence is the production of a whole, and when we try to understand it, we're always going to be doing so in a kind of as if way, because we're analyzing it into phases. And part of what goes on in concrescence is the unification of many prehensions, in Whitehead's terms, which is a prehension is a feeling of an objective datum or something in the past, another already perished entity in the past that we feel and is incorporated into ourselves as this entity arising moment by moment. And initially, that objective data of all these different prehensions, they're in conflict. They can't all be they can't all be true. And so the process of concrescence is deciding on how do I adjust this so that there's consistency in the way that the world is appearing to me. And this is a process that Whitehead thinks is going on for us psychologically moment by moment as we construct our own identities, but also we can use this same set of categories to describe what's going on at the quantum scale. Right.
Yeah. And you're not doing any weird woo here. That's the point. You're doing a very...
I hope not.
No,
it's weird, but hopefully it's not woo.
Yeah, because I dislike arguments. Well, look at how weird consciousness is. Look how weird quantum is. Therefore, they're the same, which is like a really bad argument. But I mean, it's interesting here, and this is where Filler's astonishing book, Neoplatonism, Heidegger and the History of Being, is just having a profound impact on me. He says the thing that is generating determination, given that argument you just made, can't itself be a determinate, right? And therefore we can't apply everything that we do, right? And you're into a kind of pure relationality because it's the relationality between indeterminacy and determinacy itself. But the part of this argument goes, but you don't want to try and reduce relationality to something other than relationality, because information, relevance, intelligibility are inherently relational things. They're not things at all. They're inherently relational. And when you try to, like, if you try and get even an information, you can't. An information relation is always and only a relationship between events, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And so what I'm trying to get at is, like, there's a sense in which you bump up against that place where you can't speak it. You can only participate in it. And I'm thinking here of, is this a way of finally getting like Whitehead's idea of perception in the mode of causal efficacy? I don't perceive cause, I am causation. I don't perceive space, I am space. I don't perceive time, I am time. Ultimately, I don't perceive being, I am this. Is that the right, am I getting it? Because this is his point is, if I get it right, and I may be wrong, so that's why I'm asking. His point is our normal our perceptual judgments, our standard mode of perception, ultimately is corrected by this deeper participatory causal efficacy, right? And ultimately, I can't even put that finally. I can talk, like you said, I can talk a lot about it, but I can't actually ultimately capture it in propositional language, because all of that propositional language depends on it as being the ultimate touchstone that everything is well touching against. Sorry, I'm just gesturing now, but I'm trying to make a connection here to my understanding of perception and the mode of causal efficacy, and that this is what Hume sort of half got when he said we can't see causation, we can't see the self, we can't see time, we can't see space. And I see this as an alternative to Kant, who's concluding, well, you can't see it, and that's because it's not there. We're projecting it. There's this alternative which says, no, it is that by which you see in the Humean sense of seeing, and it's that participation in causation that ultimately grounds and makes not only our perception but even our logic, what we were just saying, possible. And that's why it is the deepest, most real, but it's also sacred because it's ultimately something we can never grasp and possess. We can only love it and go and confront its mystery again and again and again. How is that? Is that working for getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, causality for Kant was a category that the understanding adds to experience, and Hume was, and as Whitehead reads Hume, discovering without realizing it that we simply see with our eyes, that causality is a bodily feeling.
Yeah.
Right. We are it in a sense, and so we can't perceive it, and we can think it, but we have to think it in a way that doesn't obscure it. And it's in some ways inevitable that as organisms became more equipped with sense organs, that especially the eyes, as the primary example of this, allow us to have this sense of perspective on the world, perspective as if we were looking into it from the outside. And that is a very tempting illusion, especially for an organism that also has language and this capacity for kind of virtualization of experience. Right? We have all these affordances that invite us to inhabit a virtual world and to feel detached from the causal nexus that we are. We're invited to think of ourselves as though we were not that. And Whitehead is trying to, he says the philosophers have been so obsessed with their visual feelings, they have neglected their visceral feelings.
Yeah. And so, I've been like perception, and if what you mean by perception is picturing, I can't picture causation. But if what you mean is, participating, I can participate causation. In fact, I'm doing it right now. I am it. I'm not even to say I'm doing it is to drop into the substance language that prevents me from realizing that it's profound participation before subject, object, agent, subject, predicate thing happening.
Yeah. I don't think we could say it. We can't say it better than that.
Sorry, but that that we're like all this circumambulation ostension into that profound participation, that profound interiority, and the way it can be mysterious and sacred, and we can love it because we 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 participate it. That's what love ultimately is, right? For you, the name God lands there. Is that right?
Mm. It depends on the context.
Okay, so
Which
okay,
I don't mean to be a university president in Congress when I say that, but it does, right? God can mean many things. Like you get a sense when someone uses it where they're coming from, and if it's coming from a judgmental fundamentalist, I want nothing to
how
do
would
with
you
that
use
conversation.
how would you use it
Oh,
though? That's what I was asking. Would you find it appropriate if I said, "Oh, that's what Matt meant by the soul of nature." That what we've been sort
mm,
of pushing towards and ascending towards.
yes, um, that is what I mean. Yeah, uh, causal efficacy, but an understanding of causal efficacy that allows us to see how our own um, felt experience is a participation in that, where when we think of our own agency, it's not something else besides the causal efficacy that um, is flowing through my nervous system,
Well,
right?
this is what always bothered me about Hume. It's like he
Mm,
does all this and he does it by making use of the distinction between ideas and impression, but ultimately
mm,
there's a
mhm,
participation relationship between ideas and impressions. That's what empiricism is grounded on. There's a
right.
causation that's smuggled in at the heart of the epistemology that's used to deny any causation at all. And I
Mhm.
always found that very troubling. And I couldn't get my epistemology professor to acknowledge that point. But I could tell that I was annoying him. So maybe that was all you could get of the gravity of it.
Right.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, yeah, I was looking for a passage in part 5 of Process and Reality where Whitehead he's talking about the relationship between God and the world, but then all of a sudden he talks about this analogy to our own bodily feeling of um, the manyness of the world flowing into uh, our perceptual field and somehow being unified in our sense of appreciation for it, for existence.
Well, I thought of the
I
analogy of where, how Whitehead said, yes, God transcends the world, but to the equal degree that the world transcends God, and God is immanent to
right.
the world to the degree the world is immanent in God. And I was thinking,
Mm-hmm.
that also works for mind and body. The mind transcends the body
Yep.
transcends the mind, the body's immanent in the mind is immanent in the body,
Right.
and that there's
Hmm.
something wrong with the language, and we're trying to break past it.
Yep.
Matt, I'm sorry, I'm the one that has to go this time,
Okay.
and
No
we could
worries.
talk about this. I think though, and Greg, I hope I wasn't being too. I was being very driven today. I'm very much. I'm sorry, this will sound pretentious out of context. I feel very called as I'm preparing for the next series, Walking the Philosophical Silk Road, to the what I see, and increasingly people are agreeing with me, this advent of the sacred. The sacred is trying to be born in a new way. And I was really trying to give voice to that and speak to that. And Matt, and I'm diving very deeply into Whitehead, and Matt has drunk very deeply from that well, and often he reminds me of like uh, when Merry and Pippin drink that water in the forest, and then they can they're more alive and they can speak more deeply. And Matt has drunk from the Whiteheadian well, and I find that he articulates it beautifully. And so I really wanted to push on this, Matt, and you were so gracious and so responsive and so responsible. And I think where we got to, I was very happy with where we got to, this sense of how this can be completely naturalistic, be very profound, give it understand why it would convey and generate a sense of sacredness, why it leans into ultimacy. All of this, I think, and then you made, and I think easy, not simplistic but easy allusions to, look at how this connects up with quantum. You can make similar arguments how it connects at the cosmological level to relativity. Like this is, I think, a really, really profound framework. And I wanted to thank you for really standing in and standing for Whitehead and his worldview and your own very, very powerfully. And I will now stop talking because I've talked a lot, and I want Greg and you to have the final word, and then we'll wrap it up. Just
Yeah.
thank you, Matt.
No,
Thank you
first
so
off,
much.
I appreciated I adopted a little bit more of an observer role, but I really appreciated the press. I appreciated what I really felt like is the angling down to the participatory core. Um, and I'll just now speak very briefly as a psychotherapist. I mean, one of the things that I'm looking for in soulment is the felt sense of participation in the world toward a concern and through and through, you know. I mean, and it is the alienation of that that so often manifests itself as sort of the underlying concern that you realize. I'm out of place. It makes no sense. I don't belong. Over and over, this felt sense of disjuncture, this felt sense of I don't know who I am in relationship to the world, and it just it pervades a sense of angst. And so if we think about meaning in life, if we think about sort of the core of ultimate concern, if we think about pre-egoic, trans-egoic kinds of structures, I thought the way the two of you narrated that and its core relationship to the sacred is quite beautiful, and it certainly resonates if we take more mundane or whatever sort of everyday human concerns of the clinic room. There's actually a real set of genuine parallels that I can see resonant. And I think when we think about the meaning crisis and we think about transcendent naturalism, it's between, we're going to go very abstract, we're going to go very philosophical, and we're also going to go very here and now, and the capacity to make that line. So that's where I was headed, or at least in my, that's where my imaginal world took me to connect into the real lives of real people in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and to pick up from that, the psychological importance of this conversation, and tie it back to what you were saying about primate evolution earlier. And a lot of my thinking on that question comes through Robert Bellah, Religion and Human Evolution, the first couple of chapters of that, where he's talking about parental care and this extended period of neoteny that gets really turned on a super drive with humans, but was already there with primates, and this relaxed field where the young can play and through play learn, and that what makes us human is in some sense just a increased emphasis on that process. And the idea that say the Richard Dawkins types would say, like, the universe doesn't care about you, on some level we do need to get beyond our need for that kind of egoic gratification, to think that the universe cares about each one of us in some like parental relationship or whatever. But at the same time, when you look at primate evolution, like this capacity for love and care to afford a type of deepening of experience through learning to emerge, and this play behavior that got cultivated, at least at the level of primates, the universe did begin to care about itself, right? And so even if we don't want to go beyond that, I think that's a profound hint that might lead us into a deeper kind of inquiry than a sort of just atheistic, the universe has no meaning type of posture, right? Maybe maybe that's not the end of the story.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you so much. And Matt, I look forward to talking to you again at great length.
Likewise. Yeah, thank you both.
Thanks so much, Matt.
So much fun, so generative. I'll be thinking a lot about this conversation. Look forward to actually listening to it again.